I'm Craig. I'm the chair of the Climate Friendly Food Committee, and I'm so happy to see so many people attending this meeting tonight. We are part of the Portland Climate Reality Project chapter and host a monthly meeting where we talk about how food choices impact climate change and things that we can do as individuals to make a positive difference. And I'm so proud of you, Steve, to see the huge group of people that you've brought to this night. And I understand why so many of us are interested in hearing this. We have three great speakers that are lined up who you're personally invested in the work that they've done, Steve, in terms of the amount of reading and communicating you've done with them. And I recall months ago when you first mentioned to me that you would like to see us do something to bring these ideas to a larger audience. So thank you so much for the work that you've done to make tonight happen. As a friend and as a coworker in climate activism, I'm so proud of you to see how many people are here this evening. And with that said, I will pass the night over to you, Steve. And you'll need to unmute.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Can everybody hear me okay now? I just turned my mic back on.
Yes.
So I'm very grateful to you, Craig and Amy, for allowing the Climate Friendly Food Committee to host this meeting. So we have a platform to host this meeting. Our group is based in Portland, but I'm in Eugene. And I'm very happy that Glen, Merzer, and Sailesh Rao and Gerard Bisshop have agreed to be speakers at this event. I discovered the three of you back in October when I participated in another webinar and heard you speak. And this topic has been very dear to me for quite a number of years now. But when I read Glen's book, Food is Climate, and saw Sailesh's videos and website, it just basically validated things that I've been speaking about for about 15 years now. And I thought, wow, we need to get this message out to the whole world. And so the media wasn't willing to do it. So I decided, okay, I'll just put on my own webinar and invite the world. And we have part of the world here.
So I'm going to just set the stage and then hand it over to Gerard to continue. And then Glen will finish us off. So, we are in a very unique position in human history because we are the first species, first generation that discovered that we are holding the climate steering wheel on spaceship Earth. And each one of us has control of that wheel. And we can turn it this way or that, depending on what we do. Some of us have more impact on the wheel than others, but we are all born with that wheel. So given that responsibility, okay, I wanted to look at what it is that we can do. And I'm a systems engineer by profession. So in engineering, we put everything on the table and we look at how do we solve this problem. So there are no sacred cows in engineering. I'm going to start with what I realized in 2009. And actually before this, I joined Climate Reality Project in 2006. I wrote to Mr. Gore when I saw his first presentation before the movie in Convenience and Truth had come out. And I was so shocked by what he was saying. I wrote to him and I said, how can I help you out? So I got trained in the second batch that he trained. And, but very soon I was getting, disillusioned with the absence of animal agriculture and its impact in the slideshows that he was giving. So I wrote to him, and I know some of you obviously know the history. I wrote letters. I got 72 of my colleagues to sign that letter. So anyway, and I stepped out of it in 2012. But in 2009, I was in this forest in the Western Ghats of India. And as a systems engineer, I was amazed at the perfection of nature. Nature is the absolute perfect system design. Everything belongs exactly as it is. There is no such thing as waste in nature. What is the output of one becomes the input of another. And I was contemplating this and I'm thinking, are we the only species that doesn't belong in nature? Because as soon as you take us out, the forest just thrives. But you put human beings in and we destroy things and we add plastic pollution, all kinds of things, right? So that doesn't seem to have the same cyclical nature that every other being works with. Then in 2010, a year later, my granddaughter was born, and she became my teacher, because when I saw her for the first time, I was thinking that we are the only species that doesn't belong. And she looked at me and she had this knowing smile, as if she was saying, "What do you mean I don't belong? I belong exactly as I am, and you haven't understood me yet." So that got me on this journey of discovery. They say genuine systems analysis, William Aufels wrote that in his book, genuine systems analysis is not about solutions, it's about understanding. And when you understand the problem correctly, then the solution just presents itself. So that's what I'm going to show you. So if you've all seen the land use and fossil fuel emissions on an annual basis, and this is data from the CDIAC. And it shows how currently fossil fuels are causing more of the emissions and land use is causing very little. Okay, it's about 15% or so. But CO2 emissions, and we are also told that CO2, once you emit, stays there for thousands of years. Okay? There's long tail, there's a sting in the tail. So CO2 stays in the atmosphere for tens of thousands of years, actually. So then if you look at 1850, you will see that land use was the leading cause of anthropogenic CO2 emissions, okay, in 1850. Right now, it's coal, oil, and gas, and all the fossil fuels. But since CO2 is supposed to stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years, why did we stop looking at beyond 1850? So we should be looking at CO2 emissions throughout, right? And when you do that, and actually, if you look at the cumulative emissions from 1850 onwards, land use is actually not that, it's the second most dominant source of CO2 emissions on a cumulative basis.
Excuse me, Sailesh, I don't see the date axis on your graph. It's off the screen. Yeah,
Why
the date,
Oh,
the bottom of the screen is still the lines of the graph.
hold on a second. There is a green, hold on.
Okay, now I can see the dates.
Okay, let me see if I can change this to presentation mode in a window.
We're good. You can continue.
Do you see it now?
Yes, now I see it, yes.
Okay. So on a cumulative basis, land use is actually almost as big as coal, okay? That's starting from 1850. But we have been changing land for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, mainly for animal agriculture. So that's where the inquiry started. I started looking into what did we do before 1850? And why shouldn't we count that? We should be counting that too, right? And so then I want to set context in time, because I see this not only a 10,000 year long project from humanity, but 50,000 year long project, because we're a species that we were given control of fire almost 500,000 years ago. And then, this was during all these ice ages that were happening. And the difference in temperature between an ice age and a warm period is 10 degrees Celsius, right? So it's huge. And 50,000 years ago, we spread out of Africa to every part of the globe. So if you begin with the assumption that we belong in nature exactly as we are, then we are just like any other species. And we were being used. So we spread out of Africa, went to every part of the globe. And then in the current warm period, which is shown here on the right-hand side, you can see that the temperature curves looks exactly like the temperature rise that happened 3 ice ages ago. But instead of going down to another ice age again, it stayed flat and it went up a bit, okay? So this Bill Ruddiman had studied in the University of Virginia. And Bill Ruddiman said, this is the human effect. So if you look at the CO2 emissions from in the current warm period, it matches what was happening 3 ice ages ago. until about 6,000 years ago, and then you see the CO2 take off, and that's the human effect. And the methane also, matched what was happening 3 ice ages ago, and then it takes off. That's our ancestors doing agriculture and animal agriculture. Okay, so by doing that, we actually kept the temperature constant for 10,000 years. Human beings did that. Our ancestors did that. And we heated up the temperature by A, which is here, mainly through land use and methane emissions. And that A is actually greater than the B, that we have heated temperature since the industrial era began by B, which is less than what we did during prior to the industrial era began. Okay, so now we are at this point. So all this time, for 10,000 years, we have been heating. And now we are facing a decision point. Do we continue heating? Then perhaps trigger all these nonlinear feedback loops and get into near-term extinction? Or we start healing. So we start cooling. And that requires us to completely change the way we organize ourselves as a species. Okay? So that's the decision point that we are at right now. And so land use plays a big role in this. Okay, if you look at land today, satellite pictures show you that the desert that starts at the western edge of Africa goes all the way into India as the Gobi Desert, as the Thar Desert, and goes all the way into China as the Gobi Desert. And this is where the ancient civilizations of the world were. And we also know how CO2 is distributed on land. There is 3 times as much CO2 on land as in the atmosphere. And on land, if you take all of our land use data from the IPCC and put it together, if I take all the land that we're using for growing our plant foods and put it in one spot, it would fit inside Australia. If we take all of our built land and put it in one spot, it fit inside Madagascar and a little bit more than Madagascar. It's about 1% of the land area of the planet. Okay. So if we take all the land we use for biofuels and put it in one spot, it will fit into the southern part of Africa. Timberland will cover all of North America and a little bit of all of Central America and a little bit of South America. Original forests, this is where the biodiversity still exists, it's in the bottom half of South America. So the vast majority of the land we are using is for growing animal foods. That's 43% of the land area of the planet. Okay, and that's only providing us with 12% of the food we eat by weight. And this is IPCC's data from 5th Assessment Report. And then the deserts, if you put all the deserts in one spot, it'll go from western edge of Africa all the way into China and India. Okay, so this tells you that land has a huge impact on the climate. And then we looked at where is the CO2 on land? How is it distributed? And it turns out that 98% of the CO2 is in this white region. Only 2% of the CO2 is in the grazing land and deserts put together. Okay, so that's 37% of the land area of the planet is only containing 2% of the CO2 on land. And the remaining 98% of the CO2 is where 3 trillion trees are contributing the carbon sequestration on land. So the solution that's staring us in the face is that if we start eating plant foods and we return the land that we are currently using for raising animals back to nature, we can literally suck down the CO2 that's on the atmosphere and reverse climate change. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and let Gerard Bisshop continue.
Well, thank you, Sailesh. Yeah, I'll just briefly go through a few of the other critical issues that affect us humans on planet Earth right now. Climate change is just one of the crises we face. You're probably familiar with the WWF's overshoot, and that if all humans ate or consume like North Americans, we'd need 5 planet Earths to support that consumption. So let's delve into that in a little bit more detail. There've been a system of planetary boundaries that's been well investigated now, and these are the systems that support life on Earth. And the work that's done on them is how are we traveling with them? What are their limits? Have we overstepped those limits? And it turns out we have overstepped the limits of several of these planetary boundaries, and several of them are still unknown. But by definition, if we overstep the planetary boundary of any one of these, it endangers all life on Earth. So let's look at if you can look at this diagram on the right-hand side here, you look at the dots, the black dots within that diagram, they represent agriculture and the impact that agriculture has had on these planetary boundaries. So in other words, what's driving most of the planetary boundaries where we've overstepped the limits is actually agriculture. And I'll just run through a few things. Global food production is the single largest driver of environmental degradation and transgression of planetary boundaries. That's well known now. Biodiversity loss, which is perhaps the greatest threat to mankind right now. We're in the midst of the 6th great extinction, and we are part of the web of life. It supports our lives. It provides the biosphere from which we get our life. So if we kill off the biosphere, we kill ourselves. And cattle farming is the greatest driver of biodiversity loss. And 80% of agricultural land is devoted to livestock and feed. It's actually 83%. But by the way, everything I'm saying is peer-reviewed science. It's out there in the literature. This is not controversial, except for the end. And I'll talk about why climate accounting has skewed our thinking. But most of this is non-controversial. So that's biodiversity loss. Deforestation is the same story. Most of the deforestation is for animal agriculture. The Amazon and the tropics around that, 84% of South American deforestation is for pasture and livestock feed. This is just sort of touching the surface, but I need to touch on all of these. Nutrient pollution is another planetary boundary that we have most overstepped. It's known as the greatest environmental pollution of all, and it's killing off the natural world more than any other. And meat production is the leading cause of nitrogen pollution in USA and Europe and other areas that it's been well studied. And there are now 300 to 400 ocean dead zones from nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. Water. We're running out of water. 40% of the world's aquifers are overused. And of course, it takes 6 times more water to grow a kilogram of protein from animal sources than it does plant sources. And 20 times more water to grow calories from beef, for example, than from grain or potatoes. So our system of producing food is just not sustainable. One of the papers said that the current system, as we know it now, can sustainably support 3.8 billion people. So we can only sustain half the population that we currently do. What we're doing now is we're sucking it down below sustainable levels. So we're killing ourselves in the end through water. Ocean ecosystems, we've done a tremendous job of wiping these out. We've overfished and wiped out 90% of the fish that we eat. The bottom trawling has ploughed the continental shelves around the world, destroying ecosystems. And now we've started on the open oceans where we're creating havoc out there. Climate change, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail, it's well known that food will cause dangerous climate warming, even if we cut carbon dioxide to 0. So what this is the sort of leading edge science that I'll talk about now, that's not sort of gained mainstream acceptance, but it's just as true. It's being it's coming out now that the IPCC greenhouse gas conventions, the way we measure emissions and who's responsible for what, are just not fit for purpose. And what's happened now is that fossil fuel, if you ask anyone what's causing global warming, most people will say fossil fuels, carbon dioxide. Well, not true. Fossil fuels have caused just 20% of current global warming. Did you catch that? Up to now, fossil fuels have caused just 20% of global warming. And the reason for that is that when we burn fossil fuels, we also create sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, which mask or cool the planet. It's that global dimming you may have heard. If ever you go to a big metropolis near a lot of manufacturing, you'll see this white haze in the air. Well, that's these sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides that are actually bouncing back the sun rays and cooling the planet. However, methane has caused half the global warming to date. And most of the fossil fuel, 20%, is its methane component. So if we were thinking about what are the climate policies that we would need to enact to deal with climate change, don't you think we should be looking at methane rather than carbon dioxide? By the way, by the end of the century, that 20% of fossil fuels will increase because carbon dioxide lasts for a long time. But we have a solution for that. We can draw down that carbon dioxide, as Sailesh Rao mentioned. The highest impact climate solution of any, bar none, and it's been well studied, is to rewild vegetation. And it turns out that 41% of the global pastures were forest. So if we rewild that part that was forest back to forest, then we can effectively draw down decades of emissions. Just to put that in perspective, I've been doing a little bit of work on regenerative grazing, and if we replenish the world's grazing soils, the world's grasslands, back up to their pristine condition, the amount of carbon we're going to sequester is shown here on this graph. It's 15 gigatons of CO2. Compare that with the carbon that has been lost from the world's cropland, which is the middle bar, and compare that to the carbon just on grazing lands that used to be forest. If we reforest those grazing lands, we'll get many, many more times than if we replenish all the world's grasslands. And of course, the regenerative grazing crowd are not going to do that. It's always going to be a boutique thing. Only a small part of the world's grazing soils will ever be replenished. So as Sailesh tipped on before, the land use change and the deforestation emissions have always been greater up until the 80s, the late 70s, I think. They've always been greater than than fossil fuels. But if you look back over history, they are greater. So that's another way that the IPCC conventions blinker us. They start at 1850, which limits our understanding. So that fix by repurposing, rewilding the grazing lands back to forest is also the cheapest way to solve climate change. Because as we saw, 43% of the land provides us with 12% of our food. That's the land we devote to animal agriculture. And 6% of the land, which grow human crops, give us 85% of our food. The rest, the other few percent, is seafood. So a vegan diet, as we saw, reduces land use by an area the size of Africa. And as Jonathan Foley, the guy who heads up Project Drawdown, he said that things happen very, very, very slowly and then all at once. So this is what we're going to see soon. The light bulb will go on. We'll soon take off the blinkers that have been stopping us from seeing these things, and we're going to recognise the true solutions, the ones that will really work. I've got a few slides here on, you know, to sort of counter the objections that most people give to these things. I'll go through them now, and it might help answer some questions later on. So how much food do we get from grazing lands? Well, it turns out that all the world's ruminants, the ones who eat grass, the ones who exclusively eat grass, we get just 0.5% of our protein from that source. And all the ones that use grass at some point mostly include dairy. We get 14% of our protein from the world's red meat and dairy. Okay, the ones that are exclusively fed on grass are actually malnourished. That's why they finish them on grain, and it builds them up quicker. So what about the billions of bison that used to roam the plains? Well, the biomass of farmed animals now is 7 times greater than 10,000 years ago, the start of after the last ice age. So on this graph, the wild animals then on the left is 1 million tons, and the farmed animals now, you can see it's many times more. So no, there wasn't more bison on the plains originally. Some people say it's a natural cycle, and this is a bit of marketing we're hearing now. It's a natural cycle. Cattle eat the grass, they give out methane, that turns to carbon dioxide after 10 years, goes back into the grass, etc. Well, it's an unnatural cycle purely because there are so many of these cattle right now. The previous slide, most of the biomass of the farmed animals is actually cattle. So, and the cattle, of course, put out a lot more methane than anything else. And as we saw, methane alone has caused half the global warming we currently experience. Some people say that in subsistence communities, they use cattle for wealth and for food security. Well, that's no longer true. Animals are no longer providing security in subsistence community, and the reason is extreme drought. Thousands upon thousands of cattle have been dying in drought areas, particularly in Africa. Even the traditional herding communities like the Maasai, the Kenyan government and other governments have programs now to re-establish those people in crop farming for their own food security and cash crops like aloe vera for earning wealth. And manure for fertility, like Kiss the Ground, that documentary spoke about. This is such a joke. It's actually the opposite, the exact opposite of that. We've so polluted the world with manure that it's now considered the greatest source of pollution. As we saw before, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution is killing rivers, it's killing oceans. So it's the greatest source of air and water pollution. Animal waste acidifies and eutrophies water, takes all the oxygen out, kills everything. Animal waste is beneficial in small amounts, but if you argue, okay, well, we should be feeding ourselves with grass-fed animals over large areas. Okay, well, that becomes an argument for, okay, what forests do we cut down next? Because if you go extensive agriculture, it's the most destructive industry of all on this planet, because it takes up land that could be forest. And forests, as we know, provide habitat for wildlife as well as carbon sinks. So that's the end of that, and I'll just stop that.
Thank you, Gerard. That was very thought-provoking.
I've just posted something in the chat that's a little play that I wrote about these issues. I want to begin by thanking Steve for putting this event together. I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank my friends Sailesh and Gerard. In my 10 minutes, I want to try something new. Instead of doing a PowerPoint, I want to offer a couple of analogies and sandwich in between them a thought experiment. Okay, the first analogy is, let's compare the climate emergency that we face now to a far less important problem, which is our national debt and deficit. Now, our national debt is not an existential crisis, but both that problem and the climate emergency have been in the national consciousness for about the same period of time, the last 30 or 40 years. And particularly in the last 20 years, there's been more awareness and concern around both issues and starker rhetoric. Also, both issues are widely seen as intractable. Most Americans think we'll never be able to balance the budget, no matter who's in office. And most Americans don't see a way to reverse climate change. We don't have solar airplanes, after all. We're a long way from replacing fossil fuels to propel our cars and trucks, to heat our homes, and for manufacturing and cooking and energy. Just as our national debt keeps growing now to $31 trillion, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere keep growing now to around 420. We forget that there were actually 3 successive years of budget surpluses in the last 40 years. So how did President Clinton do it? He did it by attacking both sides of the equation. He raised revenues by increasing taxes on high earners. And then the Republicans took control of Congress and forced him to cut spending. More revenue, less spending, presto, he had a massive federal surplus of $230 billion in the year 2000, the equivalent of 400 billion today. Now, the spending side of the equation in climate terms is the direct emissions of greenhouse gases by burning coal or gasoline, by cows belching methane, and I would argue, and we'll come back to this shortly because it's disputed, by the carbon dioxide emitted in the respiration of 25 billion farmed animals. Now, the revenue side of the equation is carbon sequestration. That's accomplished by 3 major factors: healthy forests and vegetation sequestering CO2, healthy soils storing carbon, and healthy oceans with healthy sea forests and phytoplankton populations. We'll never get to drawdown unless we focus on the revenue side of the equation as well as the spending, the direct emissions. A coal plant contributes direct emissions by the burning of a particularly dirty fossil fuel. But other than the trees cut down to mine the coal, coal plants don't affect the revenue side of the equation nearly as much as animal agriculture does, although the acid rain attributable to the burning of coal is a threat to forests and oceans. Now let's consider the many direct emissions from animal agriculture, the spending side of the equation, just from animal agriculture alone. There's the belching of methane. There's the respiration of 25 billion farmed animals. There's nitrous oxide, 300 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, from fertilizer used to grow grain that is then transported to feed the animals, and all the other energy inputs to grow and transport that food. We have methane and nitrous oxide from animal waste. We have the greater freezing and cooking required for animal foods than plant foods. And we have the direct emissions from deforestation to create the grazing lands, as we've done in the Amazon rainforest, and from the pasture maintenance fires set annually to maintain grazing land. Now let's consider the many ways that animal agriculture reduces our revenues, preventing carbon sequestration. There's carbon opportunity costs. The use of more than 40% of the non-ice land surface of the earth to graze animals or to grow feed for animals, including the deforestation and pasture maintenance fires to make it all possible. We have the soil degradation from grazing, and we have the rape of the oceans by industrial fishing and the kicking up of the ocean floor sediment by bottom trawling and the destruction of sea forests and phytoplankton populations. And so if you want to find a strategy to improve both sides of the equation, there's no more powerful and successful strategy than to end animal agriculture and industrial fishing. In countless ways, you're reducing direct emissions, and in multiple and massive ways, you're increasing carbon sequestration. Nothing else comes close. This is the only route to the surplus that we call drawdown. Now I want to give you a thought experiment. I've just included animal respiration as a direct emission of greenhouse gases. And the IPCC, and I think Al Gore and many other climate spokesmen might take issue with that, claiming that animal respiration is just part of the natural carbon cycle, as Gerard just addressed as well. Animals, after all, breathe out CO2. Trees, through photosynthesis, absorb it. What could be more natural? But 10,000 years ago, we had 6 trillion trees. Now we have 3 trillion. 10,000 years ago, we didn't have 1.5 billion cows in the world. In fact, we didn't have any. We had some oxen. We didn't used to house 30,000 chickens in warehouses. So if we get down to 1 trillion trees and up to 5 billion cows, will it still be the natural carbon cycle? So here's the thought experiment. Humans, after all, are ingenious. We've replaced ourselves with robots for many functions. What if we were to replace cows with machines that I'll call solar-powered, grass-digesting health machines? Now, since they're solar-powered, they don't burn any gas or any fossil fuels. They have blades that cut the grass, much like a lawnmower. But then they digest the grass in a digesting machine that emits carbon dioxide and methane through 2 tailpipes. And these machines create a dung that they then deposit into the earth. And they're such fantastically clever machines that each one is an exact match for a cow. Each one emits in 24 hours the same amount of carbon dioxide as a cow, the same amount of methane, and creates the same amount of dung. They're on wheels, and when they roll down the field, if they roll into some vegetation, they get stuck. So the landowners set annual maintenance fires to accommodate the machines. And wouldn't you know it, they set the exact same amount of pasture maintenance fires as they set now to accommodate the cows. So nothing has changed. Same amount of CO2, same amount of methane, same amount of dung, same amount of pasture maintenance fires. The only difference is that the solar-powered grass-digesting health machines are made of metal and they can't be eaten, and they have tailpipes. So imagine that, and I'll ask you, would the IPCC have the nerve to claim that the carbon dioxide emitted by these machines is part of the natural carbon cycle? How can a machine with a tailpipe be part of the natural carbon cycle? And don't you think that Al Gore and Bill McKibben and Paul Hawken might be saying, this industry is that's making these machines is spewing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, treating the atmosphere like an open sewer just for their own profits. We can't have 1.5 billion of these machines on the earth. And how would the industry respond? They would have a very good argument, I think. They would say, it's very short-sighted of these climate spokesmen to attack our industry. Since we've replaced cows with our machines, heart disease, which used to kill 675,000 Americans a year, is now killing only 300,000. Obesity has gone down from 42% to 21%. Diabetes has been cut in half. Even the polio vaccine didn't make as great a contribution to America's health as our machines. And they would be absolutely right. But of course, we don't need metallic machines to stop eating cows. All we have to do is decide to stop eating them and rewild that land. And then we would have all the climate benefits of rewilding the land, all the revenue, all the sequestration, and we would have all the health benefits of not eating cows. So now let me give you a final analogy. Imagine if I were to say to you that I'm bringing on another guest speaker. He's the climate advisor to Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Marco Rubio, and he's going to explain to you how anthropogenic climate change is a myth, that the climate is always changing and there's nothing to worry about. Wouldn't you all roll your eyes? Wouldn't you maybe jump off the Zoom call because you don't have time to listen to that fool? Because after all, we know that there is anthropogenic climate change. The first experiment to prove that greenhouse gases warm our planet was conducted in 1856. CO2 was put in a jar, it heated up more than the jar with air. That was 167 years ago. I'd call that settled science. We have the evidence of parts per million of CO2 rising in the atmosphere in the last 200 years after the climate being stable for 10,000 years. And yes, we can believe our lying eyes when we see the wildfires in California and in Australia and in Europe, and the once in a 1,000-year floods that keep happening, and the hurricanes that are stronger than ever before. So we have the evidence in front of our eyes. So the analogy is this: if someone were to say, all right, Glenn, we want to bring a guest speaker. He's advocating the paleo diet, and he wants to make the case for the benefit of animal foods in the human diet. Well, that would be another science denier. I would roll my eyes the same way you would roll your eyes at Ted Cruz's climate spokesman, because we have 80 to 100 years of scientific studies, and there's not one legitimate scientific study that shows any benefit to animal foods. There's never an experiment that chicken fights cancer, or that roast beef lowers your blood pressure, or that eating cheese helps your vision. There are no scientific studies that show any benefit to eating any animal foods. And we have the evidence of, if we are not science deniers, we believe in evolution, and we know that our closest evolutionary cousins are the great apes, and they eat a diet that's 95 to 99% vegan. They're practically card-carrying vegans. They eat some insects. So I say to you that there is no basis for any belief that there's any need for animal foods in our diet. And as you can see, what we are doing is we're using up more than 40% of the planet and destroying all the oceans just in order to kill ourselves, which is a preposterous use of the land and the seas. All right, so I'll turn it over now back to Steve for the questions and answers.
Okay, and thank you, Glenn and Sailesh and Gerard. Very interesting presentations.